Welcome to the Ministry of Gray, where we break free from black and white thinking and uncover the truth somewhere in the middle. Hello, everybody. It is your host, Satan's Little Side Piece, and today we're analyzing Trumpism as a modern political cult, one that has hijacked Christian values and has weaponized apathy for power. With the ongoing rollout of Project 2025, this really extreme conservative policy agenda that he conveniently claimed he knew nothing about, Trump's had a very chilling and different response to the impacts of these policies. And we'll also look at, how indifferent he has been with the Potomac flight tragedy this week, how he pardoned 1,500 January 6th insurrectionists that literally beat up and led to the death of 5 or 6 officers now. It's clear this movement isn't just about politics. It's about reshaping American morality and what the definition of being an American even is. And here's how I'm going to break it down for you. I'm going to go over the depth of truth in this country. Why are Trump's followers still believing what he has to say, despite all of the contradictions and the apathy, okay? We're going to compare Trumpism to other extremist movements, how it parallels the CSA, ISIS, Britain First, Christian identity, and I'm going to bring in the Westboro Baptist Church. I also want to go over the core values of Trumpism versus reality. This is for those of you who maybe are struggling speaking with family members, friends, coworkers about the problems with Trumpism. I'll go over how to break down the Project 2025 policies that are already in motion, and I'll also help you confront this vengeful apathy that he is embracing. I'm also going to discuss historical leaders who've used the same playbook, okay? Authoritarians throughout history, literally, but not the usual Hitler and Mussolini cards. I think at this point, they don't care about that. They just see it as a trope. So we're going to go with more current leaders and quotes. I'm also going to go into how to preserve our empathy in this age of extremism. I think this is probably the most important. I feel like many of us have just been psychologically grounded and pounded this past, 12 days, 13 days he's been in office at this point. Not even that. I'm giving him that's how long this month has already extended in our minds and how we physiologically feel. Okay. So I'm going to help you learn how to stay aware without falling into the numbness, the rage, and hopelessness that comes with this type of psyop attacks that we're seeing going on. And I really believe this is intentional on his administration's part. He wants to fire up the base and get them all wired up while at the same time hitting those who oppose him from every angle possible to just make us feel so overwhelmed that we're just going to be paralyzed. So we're going to cover that today too. All right. So if you've not heard my podcast before, this is a great day to be listening in. It's going to have a lot of benefit in just about every aspect of your life today. So let's get into this and start making that necessary change to your mindset and understanding of what's happening in this country. So we're going to start off today's podcast by diving into the psychological dynamics that explain why so many of Trump's followers continue to support him, despite overwhelming evidence that clearly shows he's lying, his blatant unethical behavior, in this love affair with just denying truth. I'm going to explore especially how Trumpism is sharing disturbing similarities with cult-like behavior. Okay, we hear this all the time. Trumpism itself is a political cult. And I think we can see this where loyalty to this leader is a reality and moral lines are just completely blurred beyond recognition, right? So let's start off first, though, with the death of truth and evidence. I think this is one of the most striking and troubling aspects of Trumpism, is how they are just outright rejecting objective truth. For many of his followers, truth is no longer defined by facts, evidence, or even a consensus. It's whatever Trump says it is. It's so frustrating, like, even when you confront his followers with, like, indisputable proof of lies, contradictions, they just simply reject it as fake news, or they call it deep state conspiracy. This isn't just selective reasoning, though. It's a wholesale abandonment of truth. Take, for instance, Trump's response, just like in the last 24 hours, to the recent Potomac flight crash. Instead of expressing empathy, acknowledging the tragedy for what it was, and I mean, technically he did. He was quiet for a minute and then sent thoughts and prayers, okay? But then he just straight spun into narrative. He trying to like divert attention away from the loss of life and instead wanted to focus on his politically charged rhetoric. When you're pushing false narratives and outright denying reality like this, his supporters are just continuing to believe in his infallibility, regardless of the truth or his behavior. Now, personally, I think what's happening here is akin to a psychological process known as thought reform. This is where the individual is conditioned to embrace a leader's narrative as the only valid reality. It's a mechanism that's often found in cults and authoritarian regimes where the leader's truth becomes the only truth, and any evidence to the contrary is immediately dismissed as part of an external plot. This creates this feedback loop where followers don't just ignore inconvenient facts, they're reframing any challenge to this belief as further proof of a vast conspiracy designed to undermine their leader, in this case, Trump. Think how authoritarian leaders like Putin manipulate truth and maintain control by doing so. He doesn't just create like his own version of events, he's systematically delegitimatizing independent sources of information. And I think we all see this happening. And you just want to like pound your head on a target on a wall because it's just, you're literally talking to a brick wall. The reality that truth is becoming whatever Trump says it is, and his followers get trapped in this narrative, is crazy to us. But this enables them to accept the lies. Like, this is why we see them actively defending him in every forum possible. You also see this as a blind loyalty. Maybe, I mean, personally, I see this like erosion of moral boundaries in this group of people at this point. And this blind loyalty is a serious psychological dynamic at play. When a Trump supporter is asked, what would he have to do for you to stop supporting him? I mean, I have asked this so many times. And guys, I'm an atheist, so I've had the same question. I have posed this to Christians all the time too, okay? And none of them can ever provide an answer for this. Typically, they'll try to move the goalpost. They'll try to alter the criteria for support. That way they can justify the most egregious of behaviors. This is a classic sign of cult-like devotion where loyalty to the leader is absolute no matter what. Remember, he had said that famous line of he could shoot somebody on Fifth Avenue and nobody would, come after him for it. Like, this is literally that mentality here. We saw this moral erosion in how he normalized all of that Nazi rhetoric and imagery. Remember back in Charlottesville in 2017, Trump had famously said that there were very fine people on both sides, even as though these neo-Nazis are like marching in the streets. And despite the glaring moral implications of these words, his followers still didn't see this as a betrayal of core American values. They saw this as a part of a larger ideological battle against those they consider enemies. I think it's important to realize that in these situations, the leader is not just a political figure, but a moral authority, and every action taken is being justified, no matter how contradictory or harmful. It's this moral erosion that's perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Trumpism, in my opinion. As his base's loyalty continues to deepen, their ability to recognize or even care about the immorality of his actions is completely diminishing. What would once be considered a betrayal of basic ethical standards is now being reframed as righteous or necessary behavior, especially when it comes to punishing those deemed enemies. This pragmatism is being warped to justify absolutely inhumane attitudes towards fellow man. Personally, I think this is a phenomena very reminiscent of the psychological dynamics that we see in cults, where followers gradually lose their capacity to differentiate between right and wrong. Their moral compass is so deeply tied to Trump's approval that they don't just ignore unethical behavior, but celebrate it, especially when directed at groups or individuals they perceive as a threat or an other to their superiority. We see this in Trump's rhetoric towards migrants, protesters, political opponents. His supporters don't just excuse the cruelty in what he's demanding, but they're seeing it as an expression of justice. This is a hallmark of psychological manipulation where cruelty becomes normalized, even valorized, when it serves a leader's agenda. And all of this leads into a very harmful cycle of validation seeking behaviors that I'll discuss further into this podcast. But let's also look at the fear, the social pressure and isolation that Trumpism leads to. Now, it's important that we recognize that all of the psychological dynamics I've been talking about, this isn't just like a individual or personalized belief. It's also shaped by the larger social pressure of this group of people, MAGA. Once someone becomes deeply embedded within this community that revolves around a charismatic leader like Trump, leaving this community can feel like literally an existential threat. In cults, this pressure is extremely intense. Followers, often fear being ostracized, rejected, or punished for questioning their leader's authority. I think, though, for MAGA, it's not so much a fear of being rejected. It's a fear of not having that superiority, of having to face this cognitive dissonance that they're living with and acknowledging that they were wrong and that they caused harm. It's a fear of accountability for their actions. And we all know that looking back 2020 on history, this does not end well for many who fall into this cycle and trap. And unfortunately, facing cognitive dissonance and the uncomfortable feelings that come with it can be so overwhelming, it'll lead people to double down on their support, even when they're faced with overwhelming evidence to the contrary. And with Trumpism, leaving the fold means more than just changing political views. It can feel like a loss of identity, purpose, and belonging, core elements that cults provide to its victims that keeps them entrenched with the movement. This was especially evident during Trump's last presidency when critics who left the fold, such as former Republican officials like Liz Cheney, or even their family members, were often labeled as traitors, okay? The social ostracism for questioning Trump's leadership is a powerful motivator to cling to the belief system, even if it requires ignoring truth, even if it requires compromising one's own morals, which ironically supports my attitude of a lot of morality in this world being relative to the situation. But many Christians and religious folks that I talk to, when they talk about divine morality, it's like, and I'm arguing, no, it's relative. Trumpism really proves how relative morality can be, how subjective it is to begin with. But that's like a whole nother conversation for another podcast. I'm sorry. So anyway, when we look at this pressure, okay, it's often further exacerbated by the propaganda machines that grow around it. So with Trumpism, we have like right-wing media outlets, Fox News, OANN. They all echo and amplify his rhetoric. They create this insular echo chamber where dissent is silenced and loyalty is the defining trait. The more deeply someone is embedded in this environment, the harder it becomes to escape it. And leaving would mean confronting not just their political identity, but their entire sense of self. So that's why, for many of his supporters, Trump isn't just a political figure. He is a symbol of strength, identity, and belonging. Admitting that one is wrong about their following this Trump movement would mean confronting the possibility they've been manipulated, that they've been made a fool out of. And this just wouldn't be a personal crisis, guys. It would be a social one. The threat of a social isolation becomes a powerful motivator to maintain allegiance, even when that allegiance demands ignoring the truth. So when you think about all of this, it becomes clear what the attraction of Trump's leadership style is. It's charisma, power, and this whole us versus them environment. I think it's undeniable that Trump's leadership is rooted in his charismatic persona. Charismatic leaders often, in fact, I would say they absolutely have to tap into people's deepest desires and fears. They offer simple solutions to complex problems, that black and white thinking that this whole podcast is about. They avoid that gray area and instead frame themselves as the only ones who can save their followers. I mean, we've heard this all the time from Trump, okay? He constantly capitalizes on this dynamic and creates an us versus them mentality that resonates deeply within his base. We've seen this play out repeatedly, especially in his interactions with dictators and authoritarian leaders around the world. His admiration for people like Vladimir Putin and Bolsonaro has been widely noted, and his tendency to adopt tactics they use, like undermining democratic institutions, deflecting blame, using divisive rhetoric. In many ways, I think Trump has adopted the same techniques used by South American dictators, where loyalty to the leader is always more important than any democratic ideal or moral principle. This sense of ideological purity, where loyalty to Trump is seen as synonymous with loyalty to America, has become so entrenched, okay? Any action, I don't care how harmful or corrupt it is, they justify it in the name of protecting Trump. And like these authoritarian figures, Trump's leadership thrives on fear, division, the creation of external enemies. This makes his supporters feel united. But it also means that they are increasingly disconnected from reality, unable or unwilling to see the true costs of their loyalty. This is not unique to Trump, guys. And I mean, we know this. Throughout history, authoritarian leaders have used this tribalism to rally support. They create a clear distinction between the in-group, the loyal followers, and the out-group, which would be folks like us, those who oppose or criticize. Fostering a sense of unity and purpose among their supporters is key. This isn't just about strengthening loyalty to a leader, but justifying increasingly extreme actions against perceived enemies. In this framework, the opposition is not just wrong, they're evil, un-American, traitorous. And in this way, Trumpism functions like many cults throughout history. The leader isn't just a political figure, they're the embodiment of ideological purity, and the very identity of the follower is bound up in this loyalty. The follower becomes a soldier in a war for ideological survival where any means, no matter how extreme, is going to be justified in the pursuit of a victory. So why do people continue to believe in Trump despite this overwhelming evidence of lies and unethical behavior? Clearly, it's in psychological mechanisms at play that are not just unique to Trump, but are deeply rooted in the dynamics of cults and authoritarian movements. These mechanisms involve the rejection of objective facts, blind loyalty, and the moral erosion that allows cruelty to be justified with intense social pressure to maintain allegiance. Hey, listeners! Satan's little side piece here. I really hope you're enjoying the show so far, and if you're loving what you hear, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Stay updated with all of my episodes. Your support really helps me grow and reach more people like yourself. And guess what? There's even more for you over on my website, mogpodcast.com. That's mogpodcast.com. Please check it out. Get the scoop on upcoming episodes, exciting guests, and all the ways you can support this podcast. Thanks for being part of the Mogcast family. While I realize that we're probably going to have some opposition listening to this podcast, I know a lot of you are like myself, and you're trying to find ways to draw parallels with Trump's extremist positions to that of other groups that we have seen in our history. And so in this segment, I'm going to basically break down, Trumpism, but instead of going over the same old debates that we're hearing in live stream after podcast over podcast, I'm going to take a further step back and I want to examine this movement through a different lens. I'm going to literally compare it to other extremist movements that share radicalized, exclusionary, and apocalyptic worldviews. All right. This doesn't mean I'm equating them. All right. I'm only drawing parallels because I think it's important that we examine similarities to better understand how these mechanisms of Trumpism are actually impacting society that we live in. I'm going to break it down with 5 extremist movements. Some are historical, some are contemporary. But one thing you're going to notice is that they share a striking overlap with an ideology. I want to start first with the Covenant, the Sword, and the Arm of the Lord, CSA. Okay? This was a violent Christian identity militia that was active back in the 1980s, and I really see a resurgence of their mentality with groups like the Boogaloo Boys, the Proud Boys, and so on. Okay? These guys promoted a white supremacist theocracy, and they believed in a holy war, okay, against what they saw as a corrupt anti-Christian government. And I feel like our nation is really seeing this within Trumpism. And here's the parallel, okay? Let's look at the January 6th insurrection at the U.S. Capitol. I really feel that this embodies the CSA's vision in many ways. Like for many of the rioters involved, that day wasn't just about overturning an election. It was a fucking crusade, guys. A holy war against a government they believed had betrayed them. They were going in there with nooses and, those plastic handcuffs. They were calling to literally hang different members of Congress, looking for them, searching them out. They were even going to punish Pence, okay? Trump's rhetoric of saving the nation and the religious imagery he had employed leading up to and during his speeches, like his "we have to take back our country" and "fighting for God and country" lines that he used, these are very, very much what CSA would spout. And I'm going to be honest with you, I don't think Trump actually knows who CSA is. Okay, I firmly believe he doesn't realize that. I'm just pointing out the parallels here. Next up, let's go to the other extreme end of this. All right, let's get out of Christianity and jump into Muslim ideology with ISIS. ISIS, yes, okay. This extremist group, they demanded absolute loyalty to a singular leader. They controlled information through propaganda. They claimed to be the only force protecting true believers from a corrupt outside world. All right. Trump's cult of personality and his famous "I alone can fix it" rhetoric are straight out of this playbook. Like ISIS, Trumpism thrives on the idea that its leader is the sole savior, the only one who can protect his followers from existential threats, whether it's immigrants, the deep state, a stolen election. His call for absolute loyalty, especially to the point of disregarding democratic principles, mirrors the way ISIS demanded total devotion. Remember how Trump used slogans like "we are one people, one nation, and one glorious destiny" to reinforce the notion of a singular, united front under his rules? That's the same us versus them mentality at play that ISIS uses. We can also go to a more democratic state that has a similar problem that we're seeing. Like, look at Britain First movement. Okay, this is a UK-based nationalist group that uses Christian imagery to push anti-immigrant and anti-Muslim policies. They're known to exploit fear and xenophobia to rally support. That way they can complete this exclusionary vision of their society over there in Britain. The MAGA movement's focus on white Christian nationalism, this is a direct parallel to Britain First. From the Muslim ban to taking our country back, Trumpism has consistently framed itself as a movement to preserve a specific cultural and religious identity, okay? One that it excludes those who don't fit their mold. Trump's language during his entire presidential campaign, both of them, has referred to Mexican immigrants as racists, as poisoning the blood of our country. He's called other countries shithole countries. All right. This echoes the xenophobic fear-mongering that Britain First uses. It's the same us versus them mentality yet again, but this time it's repackaged for an American audience. Consider the Christian identity movement. All right. Let's talk about this. This fringe religious group believes that white people are God's chosen race and that non-whites are inherently inferior. It's a relatively small movement, okay? But you can see this influence in various far-right circles that are supporting Trump right now. Think about it. He refuses to condemn white supremacists, whether it was his "very fine people on both sides" comment after that Charlottesville rally, or his directive to the Proud Boys to stand back and stand by. This has emboldened his ideology, guys. And in Trump's own words, he said, I've said it many times. I'm the least racist person you'll ever meet. Yet his actions, especially when he declines to outright condemn white supremacy, this is giving tacit approval to these groups. In this sense, Trumpism is allowing dangerous ideology to seep into the mainstream, normalize it, much like we see from the Christian identity movement. And finally, I want to look at something that's even more homegrown that for a while, Trumpers, I think, would never have identified with, but now they have become. I think we all remember Westboro Baptist Church, okay? These guys were known for hateful rhetoric, extreme exclusionary practices. They thrived on creating an insular, radicalized Christian community. And they always used fear, hatred, and apocalyptic warning to keep their family and followers, supporters, all in line. The MAGA movement is operating in a very similar way now. Dissent is punished, defectors ostracized, and rhetoric is always about existential threats, whether it's socialism, globalism, or the radical left, woke, what do they call it? Woke ideology, woke politics. Trump's constant drumbeat of fear, okay, telling his followers that the deep state is trying to destroy America and warning of a future takeover by left-wing forces, okay? This mirrors that same end of the world rhetoric that extremist groups like Westboro use. Just as this church used its exclusionary messages to keep their community radicalized, Trumpism thrives on dividing our country into loyalists versus enemies, ensuring that any deviation is a betrayal of that cause. And we could also move from comparison here to like our current reality. What is Trumpism actually doing right now? Right? I mean, we're seeing a concerted effort to not just rewrite history, but suppress dissent and consolidate power under the guise of reducing government, right? From the push to ban books, restricting education, and undoing protections against systemic racism. He's also outright attacking democratic institutions like free elections and independent judiciary. Trumpism isn't just about a movement, it's a blueprint for authoritarianism. And while it might not look exactly like ISIS or the CSA, the underlying mechanisms are clearly there: fear, exclusion, and the promise of salvation through loyalty to a singular leader, a singular shepherd. So, what do we do with this information? How can you understand the implication of these parallels? I would suggest recognizing that the fight against extremism isn't just about defeating a single group or ideology. It's about addressing the conditions that are allowing this movement and policies to thrive in the first place. So let's talk about exactly what I think are the conditions that are allowing Trumpism to thrive in this country. First and foremost, I think there's a lot of economic discontent going on. Many of us. We're facing stagnant wages. I mean, a lot of people are still making the same money they did 20 years ago, right? And on top of that, we have all of these shrinking opportunities. Trumpism is capitalizing on all of our economic anxiety by offering scapegoats. Immigrants, increasing our entitlement spending, the global elite. But conveniently, it's only the left's global elite, not the right's. And he loves to attack media, right? All of these people are culprits for our struggles, is what he's trying to claim. And just like extremist groups throughout history, Trumpism feeds on these economic grievances to rally supporters. And he's trying to promise us this return to a golden age without a clear definition of what that even is. Then we have cultural alienation, all right? And you can see with the rapid demographic shifts going on and how a lot of our social norms are evolving with, the recognition of LGBTQIA rights, transgender normalcy in the society and acceptance. Many are feeling a loss of their own personal cultural identity because these social norms run counter to what they grew up with or were programmed with. Trumpism taps into this by framing itself as the defender of traditional values, which we all know is actually just racism and prejudice. But it's particularly tapping into those of white Christian Americans. he's literally pitting them against a rapidly changing world. This helps him take advantage of those feelings around alienation, helping to lead people to embrace his more extremist ideology. Then you have, of course, fear and insecurity. I think extremist movements always have to thrive on a culture of fear. Trumpism has successfully created a narrative of existential threats, kind of like, Christianity does. Whether it's the threat of an immigrant, the radical left, foreign enemies like China, 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 we hear all the time. This fear mongering fosters a sense of urgency and loyalty. His followers are going to be made to believe that their entire way of life is under siege, when the easiest solution is, instead of fighting, just agree to disagree. Allow people to exist. Because if you ask a lot of these folks about their fears about the border, you say, specifically name an example in your personal day-to-day life that an immigrant, illegal immigrant, or a gay person or a transgender person has impacted your well-being. They don't have it. They only have the broader talking points. And that is what this is at work. Okay? Couple that with media manipulation. Trumpism has also mastered the art of this, particularly when it comes to social media. They're using it as a tool for spreading propaganda and silencing dissent. When they can control the narrative, like in the way that they pressured, Mark Zuckerberg to get rid of the community fact checkers, for instance. Instead, he's just going to let the community police itself, like they do on X, right? But we all know what's really happening here. They're taking off the guardrails that was suppressing their misinformation campaigns to begin with, their pushing of alternative facts. This is how extremist groups control information to keep followers in line. They actually remove the guardrails that are protecting them from being taken advantage of and put in place a system that they can openly manipulate, but convince their followers that it's actually a freedom. All the while misconstruing those who correct this misinformation as the suppressors. It's a brilliant and effective tactic, and also maddeningly frustrating for the rest of us outside this cultish influence. But this is how Trumpism can push its core values regardless of reality. And we're going to get into that in the next segment. Okay, in this segment, I want to jump into the Project 2025 agenda. Okay, let's talk about Trump's core values versus the reality of what he's bringing to the table. It maybe this can help you better describe, converse, I don't know, get through to those that you care about why this is a problem, why they're being, misled. So let's first talk about patriotism, this whole America first. Now, on the surface, Trump tells us that he's all about patriotism. He constantly uses the whole America first, right, as a rallying cry to kind of represent his love for country and the desire to put us in our interests above all else in the world. But in reality, it's way more complicated than this. Trumpism has repeatedly subverted democracy and rejected election results. Even after when he was defeated in 2020, we've seen the aftermath of that January 6th insurrection. It was a direct attack on the democratic process, all in the name of patriotism. Trump has called for an authoritarian takeover. I don't think any of us can deny this. We see where loyalty to him is going to personally replace loyalty to the Constitution and the country itself. It's all about power, not patriotism. And this is where Project 2025 comes in. The conservative roadmap that he's outlining is going to purge government workers who aren't loyal enough. He's going to turn public service into a system of political loyalty rather than competence or neutrality. One of the specific proposals calls for the political loyalty test for federal employees. And we've seen in the news, in the last 48 hours, where this is literally happening, okay? And this is in Chapter 1 under personnel reforms, and it would purge anybody who's not loyal to individuals from federal agencies. okay? A direct attack on the core values of our democracy. They're asking who these employees voted for to determine if they're going to keep their jobs or not. And specifically in Project 2025, it says all federal agencies must be staffed by individuals who pledge loyalty to the administration's agenda. This political loyalty test will ensure that those who serve in government are not only competent, but aligned with the mission of the executive branch. You also have to look at the Christian morality aspect of Project 2025. Trumpism frequently is wrapping itself in Christian values, right? Morality, the sanctity of life, family values. It promises to uphold these principles as the foundation of American society. But in practice, it's backing policies that harm the very people it's supposed to be protecting. We've seen efforts to strip away women's autonomy, like look at the overturning of Roe v. Wade, and policies that are disproportionately harming the poor. Trump's support for tax cuts for the rich, the relentless assault on social safety nets. This is revealing the fundamental contradiction with the Christian moral teachings of charity, compassion, and helping the vulnerable. I spoke about this in last week's podcast about the untenable, the unsustainable dualism between the belief system of Christianity and its practice currently in this country. And then when you look at policies that are promoting cruelty, like separating families at the border or opposing health care for transgender individuals, this shows that for many Trump supporters, Christian morality is often just a convenient cover for policies to hurt vulnerable communities that they want to feel superior to. They don't want to be treated equal with. Project 2025 embraces this by promoting a nationalist agenda. One of the key proposals includes increasing religious influence and education in the courts. This is specifically found in Chapter 11 called Defending Religious Freedom. All right. It effectively embeds alleged Christian values completely into public policy and education systems. It says, and I quote, "Federal courts and public schools must recognize and affirm the Christian values upon which this nation was founded. Policies must reflect a commitment to protecting religious freedoms as a primary function of government, ensuring that religious expression is not only tolerated, but encouraged." Okay? Let that sink in. They are literally going to use governmental power to promote Christian teachings, even at the expense of the pluralism and secular values our forefathers sought to protect. Another professed value that is a constant talking point is law and order. And I think this past week, wow, right? We really see Trumpism touting itself as this champion of law and order, saying that they support the police, the military, and want to have this strong authority to keep America safe, and at the same time enacting policies that completely go against it. Look at how Trump claims to back the blue and position himself as this messiah of support for law enforcement. But his actions have told a very different story. Just look at how, despite the January 6th insurrection resulting in the deaths of police officers and the injury of hundreds more, Trump pardoned over 1,500 individuals involved in this attack. These people included those who were literally responsible for contributing to the deaths of these law enforcement officers and injuring many others. But you'll have Trump supporters saying no officers died that day because they died of natural causes the next day. Like one officer who was beaten, he suffered a heart attack the next day and passed away. Now, if this was their mother who had been beaten and raped in her home by somebody and then died from a heart attack the very next day, they would want to blame. And in fact, court case history shows individuals who contributed to injuries that led to a further complication in health would be held responsible. They would be considered a murderer, but not in this case. No. Rather than holding insurrectionists accountable, Trump's actions are instead showing his loyalty to his own political base, even when that base is directly responsible for undermining the rule of law. The support for law enforcement that Trump claims is out there. He's overshadowing it by his defense of those who attack them. Trump also likes to call for mass deportations and the militarization of ICE under his leadership. He's also suggesting defunding the FBI for investigating him, which turns an institution tasked with enforcing the law instead into a political tool to silence those who might hold him accountable. And as for Project 2025, this emphasis on militarization, this authoritarian approach, it's going to continue with plans for more police militarization beyond ICE. Let me give you a quote. Chapter 14. The Department of Homeland Security, DHS, shall prioritize a militarized approach to border security and domestic law enforcement, empowering these agencies basically to act as an extension of federal power and uphold the agenda of the executive branch, guys. This means that if we have people protesting, and it's already been stated by other Republican leaders, they should be able to send in federal troops to quell the protests. This isn't just like a response to the George Floyd protests. They're talking in general. If they don't have the appropriate permits and other bureaucratic steps taken care of, we should be able to go and arrest them and thwart their efforts. And that literally leads into this whole professed value of freedom of speech, okay? This is this whole claim of being the defenders of the First Amendment, the right to speak out. But again, Trump's actions are louder than his words. This same movement will claim that to protect free speech, they need to restrict it. We've seen mass book bans in schools. We've seen the intent to control what children learn about history and identity. We've seen journalists and media outlets that criticize Trump become demonized and directly harassed from his podium. And protesting, a fundamental right in any democracy, he's working to actively criminalize it, okay? Especially when he's like planning to direct government assets and police to suppress. Under Project 2025, in Chapter 19, Free Speech and Media Control, they're asking for a crackdown on journalists and activists, okay? And I'll quote it. Under the Free Speech Restoration Act, any public expression or media that contradicts the administration's agenda will be scrutinized and, if necessary, suppressed to protect the national interest. Guys, like it's right there in print. And how many of these policies has he already enacted? Exactly my point here, okay? And now let's look at this whole small government claim, okay? They're always talking about promising how they're going to shrink the bureaucracy and return power to the people by limiting federal intervention. And so far, what I've shared with you, that is clearly not the fucking case, right? The reality is that Trump has consistently pushed for expanding executive power and undermining civil rights protections alongside stripping federal agencies of oversight. The small government rhetoric is nothing more than a facade, right? Trump and his allies have used their power to bypass established systems, and they're creating this unchecked executive authority. We saw this with the funding freeze this week, right? Under Project 2025, these trends are only going to escalate, and there's going to be even more sweeping executive action because they don't have a majority to pass these things legitimately. Look at Chapter 21 under Reforming the Tax Code. The administrative state will be eliminated through aggressive executive orders that supersede congressional action. All federal agencies must align with the centralized control of the executive branch to enact policies with greater speed and efficiency. So let's talk about Project 2025. Let's talk about these chilling policies that they have already put in motion. This roadmap simply seeks to solidify Trump's control, including some of the most authoritarian policies I think that have ever been seen in modern American history. Our federal government is going to use loyalty tests for all federal workers, okay? They're turning our public service into a political machine. National abortion bans, okay, going through state legislatures, and they've already submitted a national abortion ban on the federal level, okay? The abortion rights had already been sent back to the state. He had said, let the states decide. Now he's pushing a federal ban. So he's taking it away from the states and putting it on a national level instead. Okay? The police and ICE, they're further militarizing it now. That way they can put down crackdowns not just on immigrants, but protesters. We're seeing the rollback of LGBTQ plus rights, including the reversal of same-sex marriage. Idaho has already gone there. They're going to the Supreme Court to say send it back to the states because it worked for abortion. So we'll send it back to the states. The states are going to get support, and then we'll throw it back up into the federal level again, like they're doing here. And this influence of Christian nationalism will only continue to grow. This is going to be particularly seen in education in the courts. And why not? They're getting away with intertwining religion and government completely in a way that undermines our pluralism, our democracy. So what's being sold as a movement of patriotism is clearly more about subverting democracy, oppressing marginalized communities, and consolidating power at the top in the executive branch alone. And they're selling this as Christian morality and freedom. So there's so much at stake here. I don't think it could be any higher than what we're seeing right now. And it's up to all of us to stay vigilant in this, to challenge these dangerous policies. And how are we going to do this? Look at this growing embrace of Trump's vengeful apathy that we've seen just in the last few days. Look at how his response was to the Potomac River air crash tragedy, where we had this Black Hawk helicopter collide with an American Airlines flight near Reagan National Airport. 67 people, I believe, is the head count for this. And it's a stark example of how his increasing indifference to human suffering, okay, is going to become the national norm. Instead of expressing condolences or waiting for an investigation, he immediately blamed DEI. He said, "This is what happens when you prioritize diversity over competence. It's common sense." He had zero evidence of this, okay? Trump just seized this tragedy as a political weapon and reinforced a key tenet of his movement, that woke policies are to blame for all national failure. And to further cement this narrative, he went so far as to sign a presidential memorandum officially assigning blame to Biden, Obama, and DEI policy. And what did he conveniently ignore that nobody's talking about? His first term administration never changing these policies. His FAA and military leadership did not raise any concerns about these standards. In fact, investigators didn't even determine the cause of the crash, but he issued a formal directive scapegoating past Democratic administrations. And this is a disturbing pattern, okay? Weaponize grief, cultivate detachment, and reinforce his personal infallibility, okay? He asserted that he just knows the cause because of common sense. This is a textbook cult tactic that positions him as the only reliable source of truth. This numbness to suffering is part of the cult psychology he promotes. His followers aren't just discouraged from feeling empathy, they're encouraged to celebrate harm when it befalls perceived enemies. And the question is, where have we seen this before? Let's go look at historical leaders who use the same fucking playbook. Quick reminder, folks, if you're finding value in today's episode, take a moment to hit that like button, share it with a friend, subscribe wherever you're tuning in. Also, please don't miss out on all the extras I have waiting for you on my website, mogpodcast.com. That's mogpodcast.com. From behind-the-scenes content to ways you can support or work with us, it's all there. Plus, you'll get a sneak peek at future episodes and special guests. Thanks for being here. I could not do this without you. So there's a lot of examples that we could discuss here about former leaders who use these same tactics that align with his approach. And I'm going to avoid the usual Nazi Germany and Mussolini because I feel like at this point nobody takes those examples seriously, which is gobsmacking in itself, but it's what it is. I thought, let's look at some current examples. And I know we kind of touched on cults earlier and how it aligns, but let's look at actual world leaders that have done what he's done and that we're seeing happen in real time within our country. And I want to first start off with, Rodrigo Duterte of the Philippines, because this guy is like, wow. He really, I think, finessed what Trump is doing. And he did this with this whole war on drugs, okay? And it wasn't just a campaign. It became a brutal crackdown that literally saw thousands of just suspected drug offenders executed, zero trial. No due process. He justified this by framing the situation as a national emergency. Sound familiar with our immigration situation and the cartels, okay? This is something that only his tough leadership could solve, is what he claimed. And Duterte's government has also been accused of committing extrajudicial killings and human rights abuses. But again, his supporters, he was a strong man who was finally willing to take action. But MAGA, anybody? He was also known, though, for his blunt, inflammatory rhetoric, and he used graphic language to describe his political opponents, similar, very similar to Trump's style. Duterte even once had said, "I will kill you," referring to drug dealers and those who would oppose his policies. And he also promised that anyone criticizing him would be eaten by crocodiles. Now, this sounds like really crazy, but compare this to Trump's often violent rhetoric toward his own critics. Like, he'll mock his media. Remember that infamous comment about Second Amendment people doing something about political opponents? Both leaders rely on fear and bravado, and they create this atmosphere of where their supporters feel this rule of law no longer applies. You know, we see this too with the coarse language and macho quality that Trump tries to exemplify, and it's much like Duterte's. Consider how he would declare immigrants as bringing drugs, bringing crime, being racist, being mentally ill. This is intended to demonize an entire group, just like Duterte did with the poor and drug addicted. It's a classic authoritarian tactic, us versus them. Let's look at Viktor Orban of Hungary. If you don't know who he is, he's the prime minister of Hungary that embraced in a liberal democracy. This is where he used a combination of nationalism, media control, and anti-immigrant rhetoric to consolidate his power. Okay? I really think Trump uses this playbook big time in our country. This is a carefully crafted narrative that, frames Hungary as a nation under siege. Again, I know this sounds really familiar. And he portrays himself as this defender of Christian values and Hungarian sovereignty. Again, just put Trump there and say America. One of Orban's most consistent messages in his claims is that migrants are a direct threat to Hungarian identity. This echoes a lot of Trump's rhetoric that we heard during his first and second campaigns when he talked about immigrants as criminal elements and vowed to build a wall and use the military to keep them out. Both of these leaders are demonizing immigrants to the point where they've become symbolic enemies. They represent everything that's wrong with America and Hungary. But Orban has also justified cracking down on foreign journalists and undermined independent media. In fact, Orban uses state-funded propaganda to push his nationalist agenda. This is where Trump is beginning at, okay? Remember, Trump likes to attack fake news and he dismisses any and all reporting that doesn't favor him, okay? Literally, Trump is on Orban's roadmap to authoritarianism. Orban had said something along the lines, I think, of we don't want to be a mixed race society. And this echoes Trump's own tendencies to use racial and ethnic division, right? He uses this to create fear to rally his base. And both of these men rely heavily on the very identity politics they claim to hate. They make their own followers believe that only they can protect their way of life from external threats, whether that's migrants or liberal elites. Think about it, okay? Let this marinate in your meat juices for a minute about how much we are paralleling current modern day examples of authoritarianism. I also want to talk about Erdogan of Turkey. He's a leader that has used a combination of nationalism, Islamist rhetoric, and militarization to maintain his grip on power. He is a current leader, and Trump interacts with this guy all the time. And Erdogan is also friends with Putin. But just like Trump, Erdogan is capitalized on polarization, okay? He frames himself as this protector of traditional values and the will of the people. I know. I hear it too. Now, after his failed coup in 2016, Erdogan used the moment to suspend civil liberties. He also imprisoned political opponents and he cracked down on any dissent. This is a more extreme version, obviously, than what Trump's doing at the moment. And think about this. Erdogan also claimed that those who opposed him were terrorists. Okay, he casts himself as the only one who could restore order to Turkey. And in many ways, this playbook is being mirrored by Trump. Trump likes to create a cult of personality where he's portrayed as the only hope for America's future. Trump's famous line, "I alone can fix it." This echoes Erdogan's own rhetoric of self-reliance and unilateral power. Both of these leaders are experts in rewriting history too, okay? That coup that Erdogan went through in 2016, he used that as an excuse to eliminate rivals, while Trump is downplaying the violence of January 6th, calling it a peaceful protest, a love fest. Both of these men also weaponize religion for their political gain. Erdogan used Islamic symbolism to solidify his support, while Trump has played on the fears and values of Christian conservatives. He regularly frames his political battles in terms of Christianity versus secularism or Christianity versus liberalism. Look at it this way. Erdogan had once said that the mosques are our barracks, the domes are our helmets, the minarets are our bayonets, and the faithful are our soldiers. Trump has similar rhetoric that often places him as the chosen leader to defend American Christian values. Listen to how they've been talking about creating a warrior culture within our military. This has a lot of parallels here. Now, I could go into the extreme example here of Kim Jong-un. We all know what a authoritarian leader he is. In fact, his regime is like completely totalitarian, where propaganda and the cult of personality has turned him into a godlike figure. In many ways, I do see Trump as the godhead for MAGA. I don't think this is just completely a Republican thing here. If you notice, I have only mentioned the word Republican once in this podcast, and that's when I was talking about how dissenters in the party are alienated, punished, censored. No, I'm talking about MAGA in particular, this personality cult that's going on. And within their cult, all dissent, it's not just silence. They try to criminalize it. And it's the same thing in North Korea. Kim's family, they've ruled that country for generations, and they use total control of information, fear, and militarization to hold on to this power. Do I see there being a Trump dynasty? Of course not. Though, I mean, I do know that there's a senator, or not a senator, a House of Representatives congressional member who has submitted paperwork to try and create a third term possibility for Trump, while conveniently saying those who have already served 2 consecutive terms can't get a third term. Just those who were, elected once, lost once, and then came back and won. Those guys can get a third term. So just Trump. There's this desire, I think, to create a dynasty of sorts, but I don't know if it's going to get to that extreme. However, though, if you consider that Kim Jong-un uses a propaganda machine that crafts a story where his rule is divinely ordained and that any challenge to his leadership is an attack on the state itself, this is very similar to Trump's tactics, where he uses political opponents as traitors, enemies of the people. He makes it difficult for anyone to challenge his authority, even within his own party. I think Kim Jong-un had once said something along the lines of, without the party, there's no country, kind of reflecting how the state and leadership within his country have completely merged. This is a lot like Trump's assertion of being the only true face of the American people. He often says that he's the only one capable of fixing our country, particularly during moments of crisis, okay? That's the same thing as Kim Jong-un does. Now, Kim Jong-un enjoys an absolute control of media and suppression of dissent, but this is kind of mirroring Trump's current attacks on mainstream press, who he dismisses as fake news. And you can see that they're creating more policy to undermine legitimate investigations, while at the same time bragging that they're open to the free press. I think, what was her name? Carolyn Levitt, whoever the new head mouthpieces for the Trump administration, his press secretary, she had said the other day in one of her press meetings with all of the reporters that they have a new application system, and as long as you are genuinely reporting the news, and mind you, she was very vague on what genuinely reporting the news is, you would have a seat within their press gaggles. So this shows you that they're trying to expand the reach of their propaganda machine while leaving out those that they feel don't qualify. So I'm going to be interested to see if MSNBC and CNN, NPR and PBS, who, by the way, are currently being investigated by Trump's appointed FCC guy, Mr. Vaught, to see about completely going after them for inappropriate advertisements during their broadcasts. It's going to be interesting to see who's going to survive and qualify as media. I really feel we're watching the beginnings of a state media being created. But with all of these examples and everything we've already discussed in this podcast today, you're probably feeling overwhelmed. Maybe you're thinking, how are we supposed to fight back? How are we going to even keep our humanity intact? And I think a big part of this is going to be in resisting the divisive rhetoric. It's going to be rejecting the scapegoating of others. And we're going to have to hold our ground against fear-driven political narratives, guys. We're going to have to remain focused on unity, truth, and I think this larger shared belief that our country can thrive without the authoritarian playbook. And we're going to have to convince those around us to understand this too. And let me get into how you can actually do that with this next segment. Let's dive into it. With all of the doom and gloom, there is light at the end of this tunnel. And I want to end this episode with some positivity and actionable steps that you can take. Yes, what we're facing down right now is very real. It's daunting. And we have this huge task of preserving our empathy in a world that's been hijacked by extremism, fear-mongering, and a very corrosive grip of Trumpism. I think right now it's very easy to feel overwhelmed. I think it's easy to let this barrage of chaos just push us into complete numbness, maybe even paralyzation, right? If we got to fight back, we need to do it with intensity, but also with the sense of humanity that sets us apart from these forces we're up against. Clearly, first and foremost, don't let extremism win. You've got to reject the apathy. Trumpism, Project 2025, this growing influence of authoritarian forces are all thriving on one thing, and that is to make us stop caring. When you throw enough lies at someone, when you drown them in the noise of division, the goal isn't just to win elections. The goal is to make the opposition feel powerless. It's to make us believe that the fight is already lost, that we can't make a difference. Well, we're not going to fucking let that happen now, are we? We can't afford to throw our hands up in defeat, even when we're overwhelmed by this constant barrage of hate speech, division, disinformation. We have to fight this impending numbness, this impulse to give up. Don't let this succeed at what it's designed to do. It's designed to break our spirits, like I said. It's designed to make us stop caring about our fellow human beings, about the truth, about the future. You know what it feels like, getting trapped in an echo chamber, watching as the division deepens, as Trump and his allies spread this venom. But don't stop caring. Don't let them steal that from you. The fight isn't over until we let it be. So I tell everybody, hold on to that silent rage, because it is the fuel that's going to keep your fire burning. The harder these forces push against us, the harder we have to push back. You also need to stay informed, but set your fucking boundaries, guys. Just like work-life balance, we're going to have a politics-life balance. Stay informed. I get it. Doom scrolling is so addicting right now. We all want to stay on top of the latest news, especially when it's in a time where every headline feels like it could be the tipping point. But you have to understand this. Constant consumption of chaos does nothing but drain you. We live in a world where if you feel like you're drowning in negativity, it's impossible to escape the noise. But you can stay informed and give yourself permission to step back at the same time. Take breaks. Limit your exposure to the constant flood of media designed to keep you stressed, anxious, and afraid. This isn't about sticking your head in the sand. It's about protecting your mental health. I think many of us feel this urgency like Aaron Parnas does and a lot of other popular uh, social journalists right now of just keeping us constantly in the loop about every little thing that's happening because every little thing isn't little right now, is it? It's massive. But there's millions of us in this country who are tuned in. You personally do not need to be plugged into this crisis every second. You do not need to be the hero every second. Let others stand up and advocate as well. It's going to feel impossible to keep moving forward if you're constantly tuned in. Instead, get the news you need, turn off your phone, read a book, go for a walk, reconnect with those who aren't just about the chaos. Take your power back by taking control over what you're absorbing right now. The battle for your attention is one of the most powerful tools of these extremists. Don't let them win by exhausting you. Set those boundaries and protect your peace, okay? We'll need you to help keep up the fight. You can't do that if you've gassed yourself out within the first 2 minutes of this 10-round battle. Another important thing I think we need to consider is that disinformation is obviously the enemy, but we need to be doing more to support real journalism. Despite all of the fake news, conspiracy theories, outright lies that we're seeing spread through every form of media, real journalism still exists. It's messy, it's hard, but it's out there. Find it. Support these investigative journalists who are holding power accountable, who are doing the hard work of uncovering the truth, no matter how inconvenient it may be. When you see an outlet sprouting lies, call it out. Don't let misinformation become the reality. Even in your own news sources that you trust, if you care about the truth, invest your energy into platforms that fight for it and are willing to be held accountable when they are wrong. And support your local journalists too. They're the ones who are doing the work on the ground. Disinformation thrives in silence, so help truth thrive by demanding it from everyone. Also, I know that for some of us out there, we're very compassionate individuals, but we're living in a FAFO mindset, right? We just want to sit back and enjoy some of that vindictive comeuppance that kind of recharges our batteries, or at least we think it does. The reality is, we still need to engage with compassion. And this is hard. And I know that this is a particularly difficult askance of anybody right now. But it's the one thing that ultimately saves us as a society, as a country. We've seen what happens when we let anger drive us. We turn into what we're fighting against. Anger, hatred, and division directly feeds the Trumpism movement. They feed this hate. They make us feel like there are only two sides. That's why you see them, instead of hanging out with their bros in a MAGA live stream celebrating their wins, they're coming to liberal live streams to further argue. They have this bottomless hunger pit needing to have hate filled and anger vented. But here's the thing. We can fight back without losing our souls, our morality, our whatever you want to call it. Empathy is the antidote to a lot of hate in this world, and it's what makes us human at our core. When you engage with others, remember that even those who disagree with you, at the end of the day, they're still human beings, and they're facing a lot of the same challenges that we have. It's just they've gotten wrapped up in a lot of denial, cognitive dissonance, and immediate endorphin rush of getting their validity at the misery of others. If we lose our ability to connect on a human level, we've lost the fight before it's even started. Empathy, despite what MAGA loves to say, empathy doesn't mean we're weak. It means strength in knowing the enemy is fear, not the person. It means refusing to give in to the emotional trap set by Trumpism. Don't let them define your relationships, your communities, your country. It means standing up for truth, humanity, and decency, even when the world around us seems to be falling apart. And I think my final coping suggestion is to take action. Don't just be aware. I'm not talking about the kind of action that ends with a post on social media or a half-hearted petition. I'm talking about real action. Support voting rights, support community initiatives, support the human rights groups that are on the front lines of this fight right now, whether it's standing up for immigrants, fighting for reproductive rights, defending the LGBTQ plus community, whether it's running for local office, getting involved in organizing, or I don't know, go help your fucking neighbors out, guys. Trumpism thrives on apathy, but when you take action, you fight against it. Every phone call you make, every voter you register, Every conversation you have with someone who feels hopeless, that's resistance. We're not just fighting a battle of words. We're fighting for a future, and this fight isn't won by sitting on the sidelines. The fight is won by action, by showing up, by being a part of something bigger than yourself. So let's get this clear. We're not hopeless. We're not helpless. Yeah, the forces aligned against us are pretty fucking powerful right now. And the road ahead, guys, it's going to be fucking brutal. That's why I'm saying if we hold on to our rage and we engage with compassion, reject apathy, and take real action here, I think we can really make a win. I think we can keep this country from falling into this proverbial abyss. It's going to be hard. Ultimately, though, we know it's worth it. And we've got the tools. We've got the power. Because we've got each other. As I close out today's episode, I just want to ask you to remember that the fight for democracy, for justice, for truth, it's not just about defeating extremism. It's about protecting who we are, not just as a nation, but as human beings. Every day we see Trumpism and Project 2025 aim to strip away our values, our rights, and our compassion. But the power to resist lies in each of us. We can't afford to let division, fear, or anger drive us into this apathy. We fight back with empathy, we fight back with knowledge, and we fight back by standing together. I want to end today's episode with a quote from the late and great civil rights leader and Congressman John Lewis. Do not get lost in a sea of despair. Be hopeful, be optimistic. Our struggle is not the struggle of a day, a week, a month, or a year. It is the struggle of a lifetime. Never, ever be afraid to make some noise and get in good trouble. Necessary trouble. Thank you for joining me on the Ministry of Gray, where life's complexity is not a problem to solve, but a space to grow. And if this episode resonated with you, share it with someone who you think might need it. And visit mogpodcast.com to stay connected for all the upcoming features and interviews. Remember, the gray spaces are where we find our humanity. Until next time, take care and keep seeking.